Thank you very much, Michael. Great to be with you.
Thank
And hello, everybody. My friends, nice to be back. Nice to have this time together. And as Michael indicated, it's my pleasant obligation in our time together to make the evidence-based case for diet quality as a vital sign. And since there's lots of ground to cover, I am going to dive right in. My personal history, I routinely share because it interweaves with the themes of my career. So I trained in internal medicine, completing that in 1991, immediately entered a second residency in preventive medicine, public health. The reason for that, sort of the obvious one, I felt in learning how to take care of acutely ill people in hospitals as an internist, I was effectively being turned into one of the king's horses and one of the king's men. We were doing a pretty good job at forestalling death some of the time. We were doing a pretty good job at containing disaster, but we were doing an extremely poor job at restoring true vitality. And it occurred to me, looking at the big picture, that easily 8 out of 10 patients in hospital beds had things that never really needed to happen. And you can guess what the usual suspects were: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes resulting in amputations, all sorts of horrible things. And this was back in the 1980s when I was in medical school. We were dealing with a lot of AIDS too. And of course, we also know how to prevent sexually transmitted disease. So lots of terrible things happening to people that never really needed to happen. And if you think about the nursery rhyme, all the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, nor could we put true vitality back together again. But we sure as hell could have done something about the wall. Put a seatbelt on the wall, lower the wall, teach Humpty better balance so he doesn't fall off the wall, put cushions at the base of the wall. But we don't do any of that. We just keep sending in the ambulance to the base of the wall after the calamity. That's internal medicine. I am very proud to be an internist. I am extremely proud to have taken care of patients for 30 years. But I also noticed during that training between 1988 and 91 that we weren't doing nearly a good enough job of preventing people from toppling off the wall. And we were never restoring true intact vitality. And the only chance to do that was prevention, to go back in time and prevent the fall, prevent all the various calamities that caused heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, etc. So I went immediately into preventive medicine, public health, and I completed that training at Yale in 1993. And if you note the date on this paper, it's 1993. So it was within weeks to at most a couple of months of my graduation as a newly minted preventive medicine specialist, thinking about the research I wanted to do. I knew I was going to take care of patients, but I also intended a career in clinical research. And I figured I'd do what researchers tend to do, and that is boldly go where no one's gone before. Try to ask the probing, unasked question, ascertain something nobody knew before, advance the frontiers of knowledge. That was my plan. Then this paper came out, and it changed the trajectory of my career. I think this is one of the most important publications in the modern era of peer-reviewed science: actual causes of death in the United States. So in this paper, 30 years ago, Bill Foege and Mike McGinnis pointed out that what gets listed on death certificates as cause of death is not really very illuminating. So someone dies of cardiogenic shock, secondary to heart failure, secondary to myocardial infarction, secondary to atherosclerotic disease of the coronary arteries. It almost never goes further than that. In fact, it almost doesn't go that far most of the time. So I gave you 4 steps in the causal chain. A death certificate may give only 2. So cardiogenic shock, secondary to congestive heart failure, you're done. Well, what does that tell you about what to fix? It tells you not really about causes of death. It tells you about effects of causes of death. What caused the heart failure? What caused the myocardial infarction? What caused the atherosclerosis in the first place? That's what McGinnis and Foege dug into. And this was really a precursor to one of the great modern studies in epidemiology, and we'll return to it before we're done: the global burden of disease study. They were essentially looking at the national burden of disease and the root causes, trying to get at what was modifiable. They enumerated a list of 10 factors. And by the way, I commend this paper to you. You can just Google it and pull up the particulars. But a list of 10 factors which collectively explained almost all of the premature deaths that occur. in this country every year, and by extension, the modern world, because the United States really is just a stand-in for what things are like in industrialized countries. Meaning that 30 years ago, we knew how to prevent nearly all premature deaths, not react to them after the fall from the wall, not be all the king's horses and all the king's men, but we already knew the modifiable root causes of almost all premature deaths. That's extremely compelling. And it begs the question, shouldn't we be doing more with what we know? What really captured my imagination, though, is that on this list of 10 factors, the first three, all by themselves, explain fully 80% of the variance in both premature death and the risk of all major chronic disease. And those three factors were how we use our forks and how we use our feet and our fingers. In other words, tobacco was the number one cause of premature death back in 1990. Poor diet, lack of physical activity were 2 and 3. And I thought, well, 80% of premature death and chronic disease would go away if we simply optimize use of feet, forks, and fingers. And yet we don't really seem to know how to make that happen in the real world. And all of a sudden, my entire career trajectory and ambitions changed, because I thought I really can't go after what we don't know, when what we already do know offers such luminous promise. The elimination of 80% of all chronic disease, 80% of premature death. I'll leave the residual 20% to somebody else once we get the 80% done. But let's turn what we know into what we do. So that really shaped the trajectory of my career, which has been all about translation. How do we take the knowledge we have about the incredible power of diet and lifestyle and convert that into routine action? 30 years is a long time. You may be interested in more recent data. Again, my title was the evidence-based case for diet as a vital sign. So 10 years later gets us a little more current, although still 20 years ago. This analysis was redone by the leadership at the CDC, including Julie Gerberding, who was director of the Centers for Disease Control at the time. And the analysis reached the same conclusion. After that decade, the gap between tobacco as the number one cause of premature death and the combination of bad use of feet and forks as number two had narrowed. It had narrowed in particular because of less smoking. That's a very good thing. But sadly, it had also narrowed because dietary patterns and quality had continued, if anything, to deteriorate in the direction of more ultra-processed foods, more animal foods, and physical activity rates had declined rather than picked up. So some good news, some bad, but the basic conclusion still the same. How we use our feet, forks, and fingers on a routine basis represents the master levers of medical destiny and the opportunity to prevent 80% of people, at least, from toppling off that wall in the first place. So McGinnis and Figi essentially were looking at this from the dark side, the explanations for premature death and chronic disease. What's on the other side of that coin? What happens when people get it right? Well, that's a very rich literature in its own right, but I particularly love this paper in the Archives of Internal Medicine, now JAMA Internal Medicine, 2009. Earl Ford and colleagues, again at the CDC, they looked at a group of 23,000 adults who happened to be living in and around Potsdam, Germany, and examined 4 factors in their lifestyle. They examined whether they smoked, yes or no, whether they ate a generally healthy diet, yes or no, and they used a very simple and yet adequate definition of healthy diet: habitual intake of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. That was a yes/no question. Were they physically active on a routine basis multiple times per week, every week, yes or no, and did they have a healthy weight? And I hasten to point out that 3 of these factors are behaviors and choices and things people make decisions about: whether or not to smoke, what to eat, whether or not to exercise or move. And the 4th is none of those. It's an outcome: weight. People don't choose what to weigh. They choose what to do, and what they do influences what they weigh, although it doesn't entirely govern it. That can be a topic for another time, or we can return to the governance of weight in the Q&A if you like. But an important distinction. So 4 factors, 3 of which were behaviors, 1 of which was an outcome. And they compared the 2 ends of the spectrum. So these researchers compared: I don't smoke, I eat well, I'm active, my weight is fine. I smoke, don't eat very well, I'm not active, my weight's not so good. And these people, over a multi-year span, had an 80% lesser incidence of all major chronic disease. So we're talking about the biggies: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia. 80% less of all that in the people who got 4 things right as compared to those who got 4 things wrong. Flip the switch on any one of these from bad to good, and the probability of acquiring any major chronic disease went down by about 50%, but fire on all four cylinders, and 80% lesser incidence, lower risk of any major chronic disease. And of course, by extension, 80% lower risk of premature death, because it's those chronic diseases that overwhelmingly account for premature death in modern society. So that's the other side of the coin. We get this wrong, it's the leading explanation for premature death and chronic disease. We get it right, 80% reduction in our personal risk and the prevalence of these conditions around us. And we can follow the evidence trail from epidemiology to biology all the way into our cells and further still to within the double helix of DNA. So this audience at The Real Truth About Health is very familiar with the work of Dean Ornish. This was a study led by Dean and colleagues, and they were examining 30 men who had early stage prostate cancer amenable to watchful waiting. And as some of you may know, prostate cancer is unpredictable. Sometimes it progresses and sometimes it's quite indolent. So in the initial phase, when you identify it, you have to decide, will the cure be worse than the disease? Can we just sit back and leave it alone and nothing will happen? So that's watchful waiting. You do routine monitoring and imaging to see, is there any evidence of progression? You follow the PSA. And if the cancer seems active, you then intervene. And if it's indolent, you leave it alone so you don't make the cure worse than disease. But Dr. Ornish and colleagues said, well, we can do better than just watching and waiting passively to see what happens. Let's offer these men the benefit of lifestyle as medicine. Let's give them optimal plant-based nutrition. Let's give them routine physical activity. Let's obviously not give them tobacco or any other toxins. Let's have them get enough sleep. Let's have them manage their stress effectively. And let's make sure they have good, healthy social interactions. Feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love, the six-cylinder engine of lifestyle medicine. So says a past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. So they fired on all six cylinders. And over a span of months, studied not so much the men, and not so much the cancer in the men, but preferentially the genes in the men with the cancer. And what they found is that the lifestyle intervention took 500 cancer promoter genes and turned them off, and 50 cancer suppressor genes shown here and turned them on. Left is before, right is after, red is off, green is on. So activation of genes with a lifestyle intervention. I'm sure you all are aware of the nature-nurture debate, right? Which is more important, what we are endowed with genetically or the factors that influence us throughout our lifetime? Well, it's a false debate. It's a false dichotomy. Studies like this one indicate we can nurture nature. DNA, with very rare exception, is not destiny, because although we can't change the genes we have, at least not yet, I rather hope we never will be able to, we certainly can change what the genes we have do. And lifestyle and diet exert powerful influences there. And this is obviously not just one study, it's a whole branch of the literature. And it's important to note that while genes really matter, 95% of our chromosomal real estate is not genes. It's the epigenome, the levers and switches that dictate what the genes do. That's the control center. 95% of chromosomal real estate is the settings that govern the behavior of our genes, and those levers and switches can be reset at any time. It's really there that we exert the influence of lifestyle, and epigenetics is a big story in its own right, and we're not going to dive too deep. Again, an opportunity to revisit something in the Q&A if you're so inclined. But we have evidence of the power of lifestyle interacting with the epigenome to change outcomes. This was a study from some years back in the New England Journal of Medicine looking preferentially at adults with high genetic risk for coronary disease, and you see the title in bold here. Adherence to a prescribed healthy lifestyle, the usual elements of that, and then events, whether they had myocardial infarction or whether they died or acute angina. And the answer was a 50% reduction in the rate of all that bad stuff, so acute coronary events of any kind, relative to a control group in the group that got the lifestyle intervention, despite having particularly high risk genes. So another indication, DNA is not destiny, but dinner is. We can modify the behavior of our genes. We can modify our genetic risk with lifestyle intervention. And taking this all one step further still, we can actually change the architecture of our chromosomes. So those green tips shown here at the end of a chromosomal pair are telomeres. They behave very much like the plastic caps at the end of a shoelace, keeping everything from unraveling. And if you've ever lost that plastic cap from the end of your shoelace, you know that your shoelace is apt to follow. Very much the same with chromosomes. So if you have compromised telomeres, damage to the rest of your chromosome is apt to ensue. And obviously, that's a very bad thing. So the telomeres protect that. And the length of the telomere is indicative of its robustness. Longer telomeres, better protection of your chromosomes. And other things being equal, longer telomeres, longer healthy life. Other things being equal, long telomeres don't protect you if you stand in front of moving motor vehicles, for instance, but other things being equal, long telomeres, long healthy life. And in research, again, involving our friend Dr. Ornish and Elizabeth Blackburn, who's a Nobel laureate in medicine for her work in this area, it was shown that lifestyle interventions can actually help grow telomeres. You can lengthen your telomeres and consequently the probability of healthy lifespan with the usual elements of a healthy lifestyle. Optimal nutrition, the centerpiece, physical activity, avoidance of toxins, adequate sleep, management of stress, strong social interactions, feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love, again and again and again. If we start to focus now preferentially on diet, there's another lens we ought to look through. So it's not just about our DNA, and it's not just about the epigenome, and it's not just about cell biology, because the cells in our bodies are outnumbered roughly 10 to 1 by the bacteria in our bodies. It doesn't just take a village to raise a human being. It takes a village to be a human being. And the village within is the microbiome. And you've all heard of it. And of course, you hear more and more about the importance of it. And one of the questions that arose in my world because of the burgeoning recognition of how important the microbiome is and how it influences every organ system was, well, do I need to eat to feed my microbiome now? In other words, should I throw out everything I thought I knew about healthy nutrition because we're learning new things about what our intestinal bacteria need and what they like? And just to cut to the chase here, it would be weird. It would be illogical if, in order to be a healthy human, of which the microbiome is a part, we had to eat one way, but in order to have a healthy microbiome, we needed to eat a different way. It would be every bit as weird if we told you to eat for your own health, do this, but to eat for the health of your right kidney, do that. And by the way, to eat for the health of your left kidney, do this other thing. How could you possibly be healthy? Or you can have healthy kidneys, but you need to eat a different way for your liver or your heart or your spleen. These are all just parts of us. And the best way to have healthy parts is to be a healthy whole. The microbiome is an integral and critically important part of us, but I would recommend you think of it as just another vital organ. It's part of what it takes to be a healthy human. So everything we thought we knew about what makes us healthy obviously needed to be making the microbiome healthy, just the way it needed to be making the liver and the kidneys and the heart and the spleen and the brain healthy, because otherwise we wouldn't be healthy. And that's in fact what this study shows. So a large study looking across many other studies, whoops, went backwards instead of forward somehow, reaching the conclusion, large population-based survey confirms and extends findings of other small studies. Plant and fiber-rich dietary choice is associated with more diverse, in other words, more robust, healthier microbiota, and greater potential to produce short-chain fatty acids, which is a good thing. So if we translate this into the vernacular, what's good for us to eat is good for our microbiome and vice versa. No big surprise there, but important, I think, to make that case. Sadly, although we've known all this for 30 years, and personally, I devoted my career to translating what we knew 30 years ago, if not more, into what we do, knowledge has not proven to be power. Knowledge is only power if you translate it into routine action and put it to good use. So something indelible, something luminous, something so incredibly promising as the elimination of 80% of chronic disease and premature death in the world around us has been lost, not in translation, but in want of translation, the failure to translate what we know into what we routinely do. And the cost of that has been enormously high over these past 30 years. When we take stock specifically of where are we now with food, the simple conclusion is it's killing too many of us. Food is killing too many. It's not hunger, not starvation. Our food is killing too many of us. This was an op-ed in the New York Times. Note the date here, August of 2019. Interesting timing because this was months before we were overwhelmed by SARS-CoV-2, and I'll return to the pandemic along the way here. Uh, but essentially, we already had a pandemic. That's what this op-ed was about. So this focused in particular on the U.S. It was written by the former Dean of Nutrition at Tufts and former Secretary of Agriculture of the United States. So they focused on the U.S., but the message really was about the world. And they cited the primary literature, which I'll show you in just a second, indicating that more than 500,000 of us in the US alone die prematurely from poor diet quality. Again, not hunger, not lack of food, not even food insecurity, just too much junk where food ought to be. 500,000 premature deaths. And I'll remind all of you that during the pandemic in the United States, when we crossed that threshold, when we had suffered 500,000 casualties to SARS-CoV-2, we had a national moment of silence and reflection and grieving. We crossed that threshold with food, something we completely control every year. And there is no mourning or grieving or recognition or silence. It hides in plain sight, and it siphons years from life as well as life from years, year in and year out. This is the pandemic we ignore. This is the pandemic where familiarity breeds, if not contempt, complacency. Our food is killing too many of us. This, despite how much we've known about this for the past 30 years and more. This is part of the body of evidence underlying that. This is the global burden of disease study I mentioned. So we can really think of this as sharing DNA with McGinnis and Figge's seminal study I showed you at the start, a massive epidemiologic effort to gather data from multiple sources and make sense out of the patterns in the world. This was an examination of 195 countries, and it reached this indelible conclusion. Diet quality measured objectively is the single leading predictor variable for premature death and chronic disease in the modern world. Full stop. So back in 1990, it was tobacco and diet was a distant second. That gap narrowed. Diet has now overtaken tobacco, both because we're smoking less, but because we're still eating just as badly, if not worse, with more ultra-processed foods, for instance. Diet quality is the leading predictor variable for premature death and chronic disease. So again, this talk is all about making the evidence-based case for diet as a vital sign. That ought to clinch it right there. You measure these things because they matter. What could matter more than the single leading predictor of premature death and chronic disease? And all of this was acutely relevant during our experience in the pandemic. So colleagues and I contributed this paper relatively early on. We did the work early in 2020. It got published in September, looking at the distribution of chronic diseases in the general population that put people at elevated risk for bad outcomes from COVID. We already knew at that time that elderly people and people with chronic disease did much worse when they got SARS-CoV-2. So how prevalent? We found that 6 out of 10 American adults had at least one of these chronic conditions, lifestyle and diet related. 4 out of 10 of us had 2 or more, putting them at extremely high risk. So young people with chronic disease were at the same risk of death and serious infection as people decades older. And this was hyperendemic. So again, it wasn't really just one pandemic. It was a pandemic interacting with a prior pandemic. And these were colliding in communities throughout the United States. And this got picked up by the New York Times. So Nadia Popovich and her colleagues at the Times based this article, which came out in May of 2020, on our paper, among others, and talked about how prevalent these conditions were. So chronic health conditions and the coronavirus could collide. This was anticipatory. Now, you would think, here we are being forewarned, we might be forearmed. We might prevent this from turning into a disaster. You try to prevent collisions in your life, right? But we didn't. So here again is the New York Times, just about 2 years later. It's a little hard to see down at the bottom, but this is April of 2022. So May of 2020, April of 2022, almost exactly 2 years later, COVID and diabetes, here's the word again, colliding in a public health train wreck. We saw the light at the end of the tunnel. We knew it was an oncoming train. We didn't get out of the way because we didn't do anything during COVID about hypertension or diabetes or obesity. We had no, let's get healthy together. Let's elevate diet quality. Let's not just immunize against SARS-CoV-2. let's immunize by elevating health. Let's use vitality as the consummate vaccine that protects against everything. Did anybody hear any of that? Because I sure didn't. And it was an unbelievable missed opportunity because everybody was acutely worried. It was a teachable moment. There was an incredible chance to elevate the nation's health and defend against bad outcomes, not only from SARS-CoV-2, but everything else. And we did none of that. And frankly, I think that was a tragic missed opportunity. We have evidence that diet quality per se directly correlated with outcomes with SARS-CoV-2. So low diet quality and infection by SARS-CoV-2, bad outcome. Other things being equal, high diet quality, infection, better outcome. And there seemed to be a direct inverse correlation with objective measures of diet quality. So once again, the argument that diet quality should be a vital sign, it was acutely relevant during the pandemic, just as it is chronically relevant to all the outcomes that matter most, years in life and life in years. I have to say, I felt pretty lonely during much of the pandemic as I was ranting about this and saying, there's no discussion of general health promotion. There's no talk about helping people elevate their diet quality, increase their physical activity, get healthy. Let's get healthy together. Let's not just focus myopically on the virus. Yes, it's obviously important, but there's so much we could do to alleviate the burden of prior chronic disease that's putting us all at elevated risk for bad outcomes here. Why are we ignoring the big picture? Ultimately, others chimed in. So you see this piece in Politico raising the same concern. So I wasn't alone, but most of the time it felt pretty lonely. The other clear indicator that knowledge isn't power is what's been happening with the obesity pandemic. We can talk about the epidemic in the United States, but this too is pandemic. Sadly, we've been very effective at exporting the major causes of obesity along with the causes of chronic disease. The CDC has been tracking the prevalence of obesity in the US with color-coded maps for 40 years. So you note the date here, this is 1985. So I'm just going to show you the trends. And I'm going to front load by noting how unbelievably frustrating this is for me personally. 1985 is the year I started medical school. And when I came out of medical school and residency and ultimately my second residency, I pledged myself as a young person to do something about this, to change the trajectory because it had already been bad for a while. And I'm just going to show you how monumentally I and the others who signed up for that mission have failed. So note the colors, and you can see down at the bottom an indication of what the prevalence is. Less than 10% obesity, 10% to 14% back in 1985. Okay, this is 1990. So everything has darkened, meaning more higher prevalence. This is 1995. We introduce a new color, 15 to 19%, because the prior colors weren't adequate anymore. This is 2000, yet another color, more than 20% prevalence of obesity, meaning more than 20% of the residents of a given state are obese, not just overweight, but actually obese. 2010, two new colors introduced, greater than 25%, greater than 30%. Color change on these maps is never a good thing. 2012, a whole new set of colors because now we go up to 50% prevalence, although thankfully no state here is showing that, but we're anticipating it. 2022, we now have some states showing those really dark colors where we're up near 50%. Half the population of the entire state is obese, and every state has a higher prevalence of obesity than was even anywhere on the map back in 1985. This is the trajectory over 40 years. And as I indicated, we are, alas, very good, very adept at exporting the causes of epidemic obesity. So it's epidemic around the world. It's a pandemic. The United States is arguably the epicenter, although frankly, there are a few nations not shown here on this chart that may be worse off than we are, in particular, the nations that have gone through a very rapid cultural transition in the Middle East, like Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. Basically, people adapted to a frugal diet and a desert lifestyle who suddenly became very affluent on oil money, and their lifestyle changed completely and their diets changed completely, and rates of obesity and diabetes and all the rest of the metabolic mayhem exploded. And when we examine worldwide trends now, so this was a very recent paper, this was in the Lancet, look at the date, February 29th, 2024, so basically a month ago, roughly, worldwide trends in underweight and overweight. The conclusion reached here is that This data set indicates more than half of the total global population will be overweight or obese within the next decade, roughly. Absolutely incredible. We long ago, 2006, if memory serves, crossed a threshold where there were more overweight and obese people than hungry people in the world, although they're not mutually exclusive because food insecurity and essentially some varieties of hunger and obesity can go together. But overt hunger, lack of calories, and obesity do not go together. There are more obese people than hungry people in the world. That was pivot point. Obviously, both of those things are bad. But now, more than half of the total global population, more than 4 billion people, overweight or obese. So just an unbelievable, massive problem. And yet one we knew how to fix all along if we cared to do it. We just obviously don't. And back to the pandemic again, I'll weave in and out of it as appropriate. Obesity was recognized as a major driver of differences in mortality in countries around the world. In other words, obesity per se was a risk factor for bad outcomes in SARS-CoV-2. I volunteered on the front lines of COVID early in the pandemic. I worked in the Bronx in an emergency room, and I saw this. I saw, other things being equal, patients coming in who had higher weights were doing less well. And it was also more difficult. We were already aware of the importance of repositioning people, and that's hard enough to do on a gurney in the emergency room with somebody who's small, but somebody who is larger and there's less room to turn. It was difficult for them. It was difficult for the staff, and consequently, we were doing less good a job of aerating their lungs. So many reasons, some of them mechanical, some of them immunologic, why obesity was a driver of international differences. We also find now that obesity is on the list of risk factors for long COVID, which is the phase of the pandemic we're currently in, where this is a major public health concern. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're so inclined. Colleague and I published this paper in Frontiers in Public Health, pointing out that despite this clear association between obesity and bad COVID outcomes, both acutely and in the long term, it's actually a more nuanced story than it appears to be, because consider this, for instance, obesity tracks with indigence in affluent countries, but it tracks with affluence in indigent countries. I'll unpack that just to make sure you get it. So here in the United States, everybody is at risk of obesity, but that risk is much greater in underserved communities and people who have resource poor environments where the only choice is a bad choice, where there's a fast food franchise everywhere, but there's no Whole Foods, for instance. So relative indigence puts people at greater risk of obesity in our affluent nation. But in an indigent nation where there really isn't much over consumption and food scarcity for many people is just a typical day, and people are struggling to get enough, the affluent are much more likely to have access to plenty. It's a rarefied privilege. That's the way it used to be in history, where obesity was the privilege of the aristocracy. So you still see that pattern in indigent nations, relatively low-income nations around the world. Well, if you are affluent in an indigent part of the world, you have better access to all kinds of resources, not just food, but medical care and hospitals and drugs. And the result is that obesity in poor nations is associated with better COVID outcomes. So it's a subtle, nuanced, interesting story. Like so many things about the pandemic, it's nuanced, and we're very bad as a nation at addressing nuance. When we gravitate to the poles, we go left, we go right, we call one another names. We don't stop to listen. We don't think about nuance. We would be much better for it if we could rediscover nuance in this internet social media age and listen to one another and agree to disagree at times, but maybe learn something by hearing opinions we don't already own. Really important. So that was the case we made in this paper. I move on. Most importantly is not the direct effect of obesity on the outcome with SARS-CoV-2 infection or anything else, but the indirect effect. So this has a fancy name, a flexible copula approach. It's really just looking at a range of interactions that could account for chronic disease outcomes in association with obesity. And the conclusion reached in this very large study, looking at millions and millions of people across an expanse of published literature, is that obesity is causally contributing to the vast toll of chronic disease in the modern world. So it's a major risk factor for chronic disease. And that was acutely relevant during the pandemic because these chronic diseases, notably hypertension, diabetes, coronary disease, were the major determinants of the toll of COVID. So this was a modeling study in the Journal of the American Heart Association, as you see, looking at how much of the COVID mayhem was attributable to essentially the prior pandemic of cardiometabolic disease. And for those of you who want to dig in here, I commend the paper to your attention. It's very sophisticated and quite good, but I'll just give you the punchline for today's purposes, 60%. What that translates to is, had we effectively addressed the prior pandemic of cardiometabolic disease, even if we had done nothing directly against SARS-CoV-2, even if we had not used masks and had not had vaccines, if we had simply been a healthier nation coming into the pandemic, 60% less hospitalization, 60% less death. Could have cut the toll of COVID by more than half just by indirectly defending ourselves. And of course, I'm not saying that's what we should have done. If we indirectly defended and directly defended, we could have done much better still. This is not a talk per se about COVID, but important to note that these cardiometabolic diseases were a major driver of the toll of the pandemic. So the way to think of all this is that obesity isn't really the disease. It's a canary in the coal mine of chronic disease. And in light of the pandemic, we could argue perhaps a canary in the coal mine of acute disease as well, the acute outcomes that we witnessed during the pandemic. Where there is more obesity, there is more type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, dyslipidemia, inflammation, coronary disease, and all the rest. And where there's more of that, there's more premature death. And some of that is due to acute infectious disease. And as a result of all of this, obesity is more and more being thought of as a disease in its own right. So some years back, this is 2013, so a decade ago, the American Medical Association formally recognized obesity as a disease. Now, their intentions were good here. The idea was, we don't blame the victims of coronary disease, we treat them. And one would hope with compassion. Whether well or not is something this audience could debate, but we treat them and we don't blame them. And we don't blame people for their hypertension. We could, in a sense, because these are very much lifestyle related, but we don't do that. We respect the condition in medicine and we treat it with the customary compassion, whatever that is, but not so obesity. Obesity is associated with words like laziness and gluttony. We blame it on people's character, and that's fundamentally wrong. And we can get back into this in the Q&A if you like, but it's fundamentally wrong. Victim blaming is wrong. And the AMA recognized that this was happening routinely. By the way, it's still happening routinely. And they thought that recognizing obesity as a disease would, A, help alleviate this burden of obesity stigma and victim blaming. B, invite clinicians to do a better job caring for it. And C, encourage advances in treatments, pharmacotherapy and surgery in particular. And that's exactly what's happened. So the House of Medicine has responded, obesity is a disease, we should be doing more medical stuff about it. And consequently, even the American Academy of Pediatrics has said, bring it on. More drugs, more surgery for young people with obesity. Now, you can kind of start to read where I'm going with this, right? I don't sound particularly happy, do I? I'm not. The idea that we're going to let young people become obese and then reroute their gastrointestinal tracts in the operating room, pretty disconcerting. As a physician, as a public health physician, frankly, as a parent, pretty disconcerting that that's our attitude about this. But that, I think, is the byproduct of thinking of obesity as a disease. And the other byproduct is what's happening in the realm of pharmacotherapy, especially now. So I trust you've heard the ads for Ozempic and Wegovy and Manjura and all the buzz about these. These are the greatest blockbuster drugs, it seems, in history, so much so that Novo Nordisk, which is a Danish company that's producing the first group of these drugs that have had commercial success, this one company now has a bigger annual revenue than the country it resides in. And the GDP of Denmark has been irrevocably altered with the advent of these drugs. So Novo Nordisk, as a company in Denmark, has changed the economy of Denmark because of what's happening with these drugs. Just an incredible explosion. So obesity is a disease, pharmacotherapy is the answer. Everybody gets drugs. Maybe you think that's a good thing, but I have my concerns. The story of these drugs, by the way, is extremely interesting. So this is the molecular structure of the first one, exenatide. These are drugs in a class called incretins. They have obviously a wide range of effects, most of which we don't understand yet. But the thing we knew about them was that they stimulate insulin secretion. So they basically they directly oppose perturbations, disturbances in blood glucose levels by facilitating the actions of insulin, stimulating insulin release, but also supporting insulin's functions. And the history is interesting, not because of the shape of this molecule, but because of the origins. Some of you will recognize this creature as a Gila monster. This is where the story of GLP-1 drugs began, in the saliva of the Gila monster back in the 1970s. And I don't know who the first people were to recognize this, but zoologists presumably. And by the way, this is a digression, but an important one. It's a shout out about biodiversity and how we are all in this together and how much we still have to learn from nature and how great advances for the sake of human health are apt to come not from some test tube, but from the wonders of the natural world and biodiversity. So it was noted that Gila monsters have remarkably stable blood sugar, despite the fact that they often eat only once a month. This is not terribly uncommon in reptiles. So they'll gorge themselves and they will eat. And following a massive meal, their blood sugar will not go up. And then they won't eat for a month. And at the end of that month, when they are in a famished state, their blood sugar won't go down. So this was observed, and people started asking why. And so this compound, exenatide, was ultimately discovered to be the explanation. And it was found in the saliva of the Gila monster. And everything that has ensued over the decades since has been a result of studying this compound, the first synthesized GLP-1, and now all the rest, and a whole family of drugs and modified drugs. But this is where it began. The GLP-1s that are rocking the world began as a product of nature in the saliva of the Gila monster. Very interesting. I trust you've heard there are concerns about both mild and more severe potential side effects of Ozempic and the other GLP-1s. It's a long list. Some of these things are pretty common and just inconvenient. Some of them are quite serious and thankfully less common, but they do concern me. But the biggest liability of these drugs may be the cost, because we are a society that's already mired in very severe disparities. And I have grave concerns that if we turn to pharmacotherapy to fix what we could prevent outright with better use of feet and forks, it's going to amplify those disparities because these drugs are really expensive, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So the out-of-pocket expense, if you had to pay, is over $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year. Most people can't afford that, obviously, and certainly they can't afford it for multiple members of the household. And that's often the situation where everybody in the household needs to have help managing their weight. If we're relying on drugs, that's $12,000 a year for everybody who's in the mix. So without insurance, it's out of reach for most people. But even if you have insurance, insurance companies are starting to say, we can't afford this either. So even Medicare looks at this problem and says, this could break the bank. We were in trouble before with healthcare expenditure in the US. If everybody now needs $12,000 worth of pharmacotherapy for weight management a year, we're in really serious trouble. And remember what the prevalence is, right? We're talking about more than half the population in the United States. And over the next decade, we're talking about half the population of the world. So the potential economic impact of this, good as it is for Novo Nordisk, may be extremely dire for the rest of us. So I have real concerns about that, and in particular from the perspective of public health and disparities. But my biggest concern is this: those who don't learn from the follies of history are destined to repeat them. And we've had horrible follies in the history of pharmacotherapy for obesity. I don't know whether the rest of you remember this. I remember it indelibly. We had a drug that was generating very similar buzz to what we're hearing now about the GLP-1s. It was marketed as Acomplia. The generic name was Rimonabant. It was an endocannabinoid receptor blocker, and that name sounds like cannabis, and that's because those are the very receptors that are stimulated by cannabis, but they control pleasure and reward mechanisms in the brain. So very powerful drug operating along some very fundamental pathways and showing many of the benefits that we see now with GLP-1s. And this drug was approved for routine use in the European Union, not yet approved in the US, although the FDA was on the brink of approving it when it was discovered in post-market surveillance that the rate of suicide in the EU among users of the drug had doubled, and the drug was withdrawn. The law of unintended consequences. When you start mucking around with brain pathways and brain chemistry, you really don't know what's going to ensue. We really don't know yet what's going to happen over years and decades of use with GLP-1s. We do know that if people take them and stop, they gain back the weight. So we're starting to think we need to use these just like drugs for hypertension or dyslipidemia or diabetes, where you stay on them for the long term. But we really don't know about the long-term consequences. I'm not saying this will happen. It's just a precautionary tale, and we ought to give it heed. It does make me nervous. But most importantly, my concern is that we're treating the wrong cause, because the cause of epidemic obesity is not human physiology run amok. Human physiology works the same way it always has, but we have a food supply that is unlike what we've ever had before. In order to account for a change, you need a change. And human biology is not what's changed here. I don't think that's what we should be mucking around with. What's changed is our food. Now, there are many vivid illustrations of this. I'm a big fan of Michael Moss. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, 2 great books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked, all about the machinations and manipulations of the food industry. This is a New York Times Magazine cover story a decade ago, extracted from his book, Salt, Sugar, Fat. If you haven't read this, you just need to Google Moss addictive. You'll pull it right up. I definitely commend it to you. This is the story of how major food companies have used cutting-edge technology, functional MRI machines, to design food we can't stop eating, at least not until our arm gets tired from lifting it to our mouth. Some of you, my contemporaries, will remember the Lay's potato chip ads. Bet you can't eat just one. Well, they meant business. That was a threat, and one they knew they could take all the way to the bank. Moss describes what the food industry calls the bliss point. They manipulate flavor combinations. They manipulate ingredients. They manipulate textures to optimize the effects of this food on the ventromedial hypothalamus, optimized from their perspective. In other words, maximally stimulate the human appetite center so it lights up like a Christmas tree, and basically put us in a situation where portion control is damn near impossible, and in a situation where the calories required to finally cry uncle and stop eating are maximized. Why is that a good thing? Well, because if you eat more chips at any given sitting, you run out of chips faster, you buy more chips. That's a good thing for whoever's selling the chips. Not so good for you, not so good for the people you love. But if you happen to be on the chip selling side of the equation, a really good thing. So that's what's going on here. It's basically predatory profiteering. And that's what we're up against. When we in medicine and the health sciences are encouraging portion control, we're sending people out into a world where teams of scientists using functional MRI scans and with reams of corporate money have marching orders to design food you can't stop eating until your arm gets tired from lifting it to your mouth. And what hope do we possibly have of portion control? And the answer is none. And we see the results of that, pandemic obesity worsening year in, year out for decades. We haven't fixed obesity for the most obvious of reasons. We've never tried. We've reacted to obesity, but we've done nothing at the causal side. We've done nothing to get at this. And this needs to be fixed. This is where we should be directing our efforts much more than aberrations in human biology. I'm not saying, by the way, we can't use pharmacotherapy, because a lot of people already have obesity and may very well need that help. But again, we can't just keep mopping the floor because the sink is overflowing without doing something about turning off the tap. And that's exactly what's going on here. We have evidence that these manipulations of our food supply translate directly into weight gain, courtesy of a name you may know, Kevin Hall at the NIH, who's done these famous metabolic ward studies. this one in particular, where he compared ultra-processed food, and we're hearing a lot about that these days, courtesy of the work of Carlos Monteiro at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who gave us the NOVA classification, which defines ultra-processed food. So Dr. Hall studied ultra-processed versus not, but matched for everything else, matched for the kinds of foods, matched for the macronutrient distribution, so same amount of protein, carbohydrate, fat, but ultra-processed versus not. And all by itself, ultra-processing resulted in 500 extra calories per day, which in turn resulted in weight gain, which leads to another important point. Calories matter. Yes, calories count. You may have heard, pseudo erudition on this topic. Is a calorie a calorie? Do calories count? Yes, they count. They count the way miles count and gallons count and quarts count and any measurement count and degrees count. It's a unit of energy, and the amount of available energy obviously matters, particularly in a biological situation where surplus energy is put into storage, namely as body fat. Now, the source of the calories and the quality of the food delivering the calories obviously also matters. What a false and silly distinction. Is it the calories or is it the foods delivering the calories? The only reasonable answer to that question is yes. Both the quality and the quantity matter, but the single best way to manage the quantity is to optimize the quality. You can either spend your life counting calories, be up against the Michael Moss effect and failing, or you can abandon junk where food ought to be, eat real food, mostly or exclusively plants, and minimize the calories it takes to feel full and not have to worry about counting calories because you stop eating because you're satiated and you haven't overeaten. But yes, calories count. And again, we can return to this in the Q&A as you see fit. So for years, I've been making the case that obesity deserves respect. We should stop blaming victims. Yes, I believe in personal responsibility, but the choices people make are subordinate to the choices people have. We live in a culture that gives people bad choices. And yes, this deserves medical respect, but not as a disease, but rather it's more like a form of drowning. I've made this case in many articles over the years, but in particular on the rarefied pages of Nature, where I penned this opinion piece, obesity is not a disease. Now, why is the distinction important? Well, let's think about drowning for a minute. First of all, drowning is obviously medically legitimate. We don't blame the victims of drowning, we resuscitate them. We do whatever it takes to help them, to save them, to revive them. We use the best medical technology. If we need to use medication to support them, we use whatever we have available. All of that's relevant to obesity too. So extreme medical respect. But mostly what we do is prevent drowning. Mostly what we do is recognize the vulnerability to drowning in the world around us and say, fences around pools, lifeguards at the beach, parental vigilance when young kids are around water. Ideally, everybody is taught how to swim in childhood. And if there's danger in the water, like a riptide or something, we put up a sign that says, red flag, do not swim today. I mean, just think about it for a minute. Think about the way we address obesity in our society. If we were to handle drowning the way we handle obesity, there'd be no fences around pools. There'd be no lifeguards at the beach. We'd encourage parents to look the other way. Absolutely nobody would be taught how to swim. And when there's a riptide and sharks, we'd put up a sign that says, come on in, the water's fine. And I invite you to indulge your imagination and flip it around and think, what if we treated obesity the way we treat drowning? What are the analogs to fences around pools and swimming lessons and lifeguards and parental vigilance and all the rest? I think they're pretty obvious, and I get at them in this and other articles. So I've argued, nobody's paying any attention, by the way, but I've argued for years we can have medical legitimacy and direct the remedies to pandemic obesity to the right causes in the food supply in the world around us too, if we classify this, even medically, even in terms of medical coding for reimbursement, as a form of drowning. There's drowning A in water, and there's drowning B in hyperpalatable calories, junk where food ought to be, in labor-saving technology. I see obesity that way, but I'll leave it there and move on, except to note that thinking this way points in the direction of far better remedies than just drugs and surgery. For some years, I was privileged to collaborate with a team at a resource which unfortunately has folded because of economic hardship called Mindstream Academy. It was a fully accredited high school for obese adolescents, and it was residential in South Carolina, and the kids would come, and there'd be no shame and no blame, nothing but empowerment. And by the way, you might think that coming to a school that's focused on ameliorating obesity would be associated with stigma. Very much the opposite. Some of these kids, and they had severe obesity in most cases, were suicidal. They had no vision of the future. They were desperate. They were depressed. And I saw this reawaken their dreams and the promise of the future and give them their lives back. It was incredible. So this school basically gave them a full high school curriculum, plus teaching them how to be physically active every day, organic gardening, plant-based nutrition, psychological counseling to get at what some of the root causes in their past traumas were. It was phenomenal. And not only did the kids lose incredible amounts of weight, I'll tell you just one story. One young woman, she had lost 80 pounds and had her life back. And it was just, and all just because of healthy living and healthy eating. That wasn't the most riveting part of her story. It was pretty damn impressive. But the part that was unbelievably captivating, she said, what gratifies me the most is I have a weekly call with my parents, and my dad is very overweight, and I've been concerned about his health. And I'm simply sharing what I'm learning here. And over my time at this school, my dad, back at home in wherever he was, Minnesota or something, has lost 40 pounds. I lost 80. He's lost 40 because I'm coaching him. The beauty of paying it forward. Nobody's paying GLP-1 drugs forward. Nobody's paying bariatric surgery forward. I'm not saying they're bad things. I'm just saying they don't reverberate the way diet and lifestyle can. So I've argued for school over scalpels, but we pay for the drugs and we pay for bariatric surgery. We couldn't get anybody to pay for this school. So ultimately it went under. I think that's very sad. So again, I'm not arguing against pharmacotherapy, but if we're going to use GLP-1s and other innovations, let's not neglect feet and forks and the things that pertain to them. Let's think about those ounces of prevention rather than pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds of cure at high cost. Let's think about managing obesity more the way we manage drowning, mostly by preventing it from happening in the first place. Let's stop dieting alone and let's start living it together, because it's a much better way to go. We all seem to forget when it comes to diet and health, or diet and weight, that there's strength in unity. Most people who go on a diet leave their family behind. They abandon the potential strength and unity instead of saying, let's all eat better together because we love one another. Let's eat better together because we all want a long, healthy life to share. And you help me and I'll help you. And this could be spouse to spouse and parents to kids and kids to siblings and all of us, family, households. This is the way to get healthy because there's strength in unity. We need to talk less about willpower because nobody has the willpower to overcome what clever engineers are devising using functional MRI scans, and more about skill power. It's amazing what humans can learn. We all learned to ride a bike. It's a really challenging thing to do. We skinned our knees a few times and then we had a skill for the rest of our lives. Most of us learned how to swim. Also challenging at first, but now we're safe in the water. There's a skill set for healthy eating in a modern world that makes it challenging. Some of us have it, most people don't. It can be shared, it can be taught. It ought to be routinely. And people can learn to love foods that love them back. If you've acclimated to a diet high in sugar, salt, and fat, you tend to prefer that. But if you slowly habituate to a diet of whole, wholesome foods, you awaken your comatose taste buds that require massive amounts of sugar or salt or other chemicals to be stimulated, and make them much more sensitive. I call that taste bud rehab. And it is the path for anybody, no matter how corrupted their palate has been, to learn to love the very foods that love them back. We also need to think about personalized nutrition more. We can't have one size fits all solutions. We're a multicultural society. You've heard of the DASH diet or the Mediterranean diet, but what if you're Mexican American or Chinese American or Vietnamese or Korean, or you just come from a part of the world where there's a distinct food heritage? Well, we can optimize nutrition in that lane, and that's what we ought to do. And there hasn't been nearly enough attention to that effort to date. And we should recognize the true promise of getting lifestyle right that can take us into the blue, which is so much better than what we're hoping to do with drugs and surgery. And I'm talking specifically about the blue zones where people routinely live to be 100, do not get chronic disease or obesity, do not develop dementia. They live long, they prosper with vitality, They go gentle into that good night in the fullness of time. We know the remedy for all this in the realm of food. Michael Pollan got it down to 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I've spent a career studying this. I concur. It took me many more words to say it, inevitably, as an academic publishing papers, 5,000 in this particular case, many more in my textbooks, but same basic conclusion. That is the theme of optimal nutrition for human beings. And that's the theme that prevails in the blue zone. So the blue zones are very diverse populations, 5 distinct regions of the world. You see them here on the map, from California to Japan and across Costa Rica and the Mediterranean in both Italy and Greece. And if we plot their diets, which are very different from one another, on a scale from animal food predominant, ultra processed food predominant on the left in red, to plant food predominant, real food predominant on the right in green, dark green. Of course, the blue zones all cluster on the far right side of this slide. Plant food predominant diets, not all vegan, by the way. Some are, most are not, but they're all plant food predominant. They're all real food, mostly plants, every time. And this is not enough as we think about the fundamental problem of the food supply and the environment we live in. The problem extends well beyond our own skin. We have some hope of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet, or we have no hope of being healthy, vital people at all. And the diets that prevail in the modern world are cooking the planet. So as I make the case for diet as a vital sign, it's a vital sign for human health. Yes, it's also a vital sign for planetary health. So we're in a situation now where the Amazon is fast reaching a point of no return. You've heard this. This keeps me up at night. This is devastating news. And we could fix this because as constitutional omnivores, we have choices. We can thrive on plant-exclusive diets. We can certainly thrive on plant-predominant diets. And we ought to be thinking about the implications of dietary choice, not just for our own health, but for that of the planet. And we have the option of a grand confluence where the way we eat is better for us and better for biodiversity and better for the planet. And this has been mapped out in the Eat Lancet Commission reports, and we're now awaiting Eat Lancet 2, which looks at food for both the health of people and the planet. If we dive down into this, get a little more granular, I especially like this paper, and if you're not familiar with it, this is another one I commend to your attention: Multiple Health and Environmental Impacts of Foods by a group at Oxford University. This is the one eye chart I'm sharing with you. I tend not to do this even to my academic audiences. I know some of my colleagues do, but I don't think people tend to like charts and graphs, so I stay away from them. But this one's worth a quick look. So in A, at the top, you have a set of conditions affecting humans, including death and cardiovascular disease and colorectal cancer. And then along the side, you have foods and their impact on those conditions, going from whole grains down to olive oil and everything in between. Green is good, red is bad. The other colors are intermediate. In B, down at the bottom, we have another set of outcomes, but these are planetary health outcomes. So acidification, eutrophication, which is nitrogen use, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, the same foods. And once again, green is good, red is bad, other colors intermediate. So there's the eye chart. The paper that I shared is this detailed, but we can sum it all up as they do in the paper, looking at 2 simple axes: the risk of human mortality on the x-axis here, so it's worse as you move to the right, better as you go to the left, and on the y-axis, adverse impacts on the planet, better down at the bottom, worse at the top. So the bottom left corner is the good place to be. Everything in green is nearest the bottom left corner, and guess what's there? Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, the usual suspects, the stuff we already knew we should eat more of. And look at what's doing the most damage to both humans and the planet: processed meat and red meat, way up in the upper right-hand corner. So we can get this right for ourselves, and we can get this right for the planet. And all this argues that it's a vital sign for both. So the sweet spot is best diets for us, best diets for everything else down here. And by the way, kinder and gentler to the rest of biodiversity. So we get diet right. It's better for domestic animals. It's better for wild animals that need wild ecosystems to call home. It preserves rainforests. It preserves aquifers. And it adds years to lives and life to years. I pivot now, and I'd like to think I'm still minding my business by talking about what I do now to address this. So I've made the case that diet ought to be a vital sign for the sake of human health, for the sake of planetary health, for the sake of curbing epidemic obesity and getting at the root causes of that. the pandemic of chronic disease, the acute effects of SARS-CoV-2. All of those are reasons why diet should be a vital sign. Another comes to us from the realm of business, this aphorism, we manage what we measure. But it's true in medicine too, where what matters most we call vital signs. We measure it routinely and we treat to goal. Well, if diet quality is the single leading predictor of all-cause mortality, premature death, and total chronic disease risk, it obviously matters enough that we ought to manage it. And if we want to manage it, we probably need to measure it. So this has motivated a major change in my career. I've been an academic physician at Yale for much of my career. I fully left academic medicine to become an entrepreneur, much to my surprise, in 2019, because in 2016, I invented something that seemed to me to be important enough to justify that. And I founded a company and have been running that. And that company was acquired by a food as medicine company last year. I want to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it, because we believe we manage what we measure. And so in medicine, think about the blood pressure cuff. There was a world before the invention of the blood pressure cuff. We already knew that blood pressure was very important. People in the health sciences already knew blood pressure was a major predictor of heart attack or stroke. And we could measure blood pressure. It was just extremely painful and inconvenient. It required intra-arterial catheters, which frankly hurt like hell. So they were rarely used, of course. They weren't scalable. So in most people, we didn't know their blood pressure, but we knew blood pressure was important. So guess how we knew blood pressure was broken? A heart attack or stroke or blindness or kidney failure. We basically waited for bad effects of blood pressure and they said, you've had kidney failure, you must have hypertension. That's bad. Maybe we can try to do something about it. And they didn't, of course, didn't have very good things to do about it either. So we were never upstream of the problem before the invention of the blood pressure cuff. We always waited for calamitous effects and then reacted. The blood pressure cuff changed that. It took a while. But when everybody's blood pressure was measured, we were now upstream of the problem. And guess what happened? We started developing population norms for blood pressure. We started identifying appropriate targets. And everybody in medicine, everybody in healthcare who knew nothing about managing hypertension needed to learn. It became a priority. It became a standard of care. It became a measure of the quality of prevailing clinical practice. And it led to all sorts of innovation spanning pharmacotherapy and lifestyle interventions. The DASH diet, we would have no DASH diet if we didn't have the blood pressure cuff. We manage what we measure. So what I've been involved in for these past years takes this into the realm of nutrition. I already showed you this op-ed earlier in the slide deck, Our Food is Killing Too Many of Us. I won't reiterate what they found, except to note that when they continued their argument in the op-ed, they didn't just talk about the scope of the problem, 500,000 premature deaths. They started talking about what we ought to do about it. And the first thing they mentioned is that hospitals should include a measure of nutrition in everybody's electronic health record. And here. And the American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association have adopted the formal position that diet is of such outsized importance in cardiovascular medicine that it ought to be measured at every encounter. If only we had a tool that made that possible, which when this was published, they didn't realize we did, because for decades we have not. And the reasons we didn't have a suitable tool are just like the reasons we couldn't use an intra-arterial catheter in everybody. It was too painful, too dangerous, too costly, just too onerous. Well, that's where we are with diet. So we can do multiple 24-hour recalls where you take roughly 20 to 30 minutes to try and remember exactly what you ate yesterday. And we need at least 3 different days because one day tends not to be at all reliable. Or you can take 90 minutes to 2 hours to complete a semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire. How often in the past 3 to 6 months did you have donuts or French fries or broccoli, and how much, and what did you eat it with, how much of that? As you can infer, nobody can remember all those details, absolutely nobody. Or you can journal everything you've eaten for the span of 3 days or 7 days and submit that to a dietitian for an N of 1 analysis. And this is all rather like an intra-arterial catheter. It's expensive, it's inconvenient, it's at the N of 1 level, it's simply not scalable. It's not the answer the American College of Cardiology is looking for. So I invented something that is the answer that they were looking for. By the way, it's incredibly simple and yet powerful. So what you're seeing here on the far left is a phoropter, and any of you who's ever been to the eye doctor has used this device. The device is pretty intimidating, right? I mean, you look at that and think, wow, A lot of engineering went into that thing. You'd be right. Lots of optics and physics. But our use of the device as the patient is unbelievably simple. Basically, it shows us two images at a time, and it's our job to say which is more in focus. So you look at the balloons, and pretty obvious to all of us that the bottom balloons are more in focus than the top. It's usually side by side, and you pick one, and then the tech or optometrist or ophthalmologist says, how about now, and shows us two more images, and we play the game until we have an exact match for our visual correction in units, diopters, so it's quantitative. Well, we invented this for diet. Rather than asking people to badly misremember exactly how much of exactly what they've eaten over some span of time, we said the goal of all of that is to put together a representation of their overall dietary pattern. What if we just do that? What if we build a diet map? Diet type on the x-axis, diet quality on the y. Every cell in the map is a particular kind of diet, paleo and keto and low carb and Mediterranean and flexitarian and pescatarian and vegetarian and vegan and Korean and Vietnamese and Mexican and Cuban and at 10 tiers of quality. So every cell is a particular type of diet at a particular tier of quality. We'll have our dietitians build out a multi-day meal plan that matches the specs for that kind of diet at that tier of quality. We'll turn that multi-day meal plan into an image. We'll shrink that image down to the irreducible minimum so we can show you two at a time on a smartphone screen and ask you, which of these looks more like stuff you eat, A or B? And play that game for about 60 seconds until we've got you. And that's what I've been doing for the past years. I've been privileged along the way to work with some of the best in nutrition. Those of you who watch Netflix probably know my good friend Christopher Gardner at Stanford. He's the principal investigator of the You Are What You Eat special featured there. I suspect most of you know Walter Willett, former chair of nutrition at Harvard, and you may know some of the others here too. Luminaries all. David Jenkins invented the glycemic index. So we worked together for years, built out the diet map, and introduced a whole new way to measure diet as a vital sign. Give us a digital interface, a smartphone, computer, an iPad, anything, and give us about 60 seconds, and we can do a comprehensive dietary assessment that gives us diet type, an objective measure of diet quality using the Healthy Eating Index 2020. So again, if you think about the phoropter, it produces a measure of the correction of your eyes in diopters. It's quantitative. You think about the blood pressure cuff. It's not loosey-goosey. It's not kind of, sort of. It's units, millimeters of mercury, systolic pressure, millimeters of mercury, diastolic pressure. It's quantitative. It's actionable. So that's what we're doing for diet. A measure on a 1 to 100 scale, the Healthy Eating Index. And we also know servings per day of all the different food groups, units per day of over 200 nutrients. So we're basically on a mission to make diet quality a vital sign. And we say that diet ID is to diet as the blood pressure cuff is to blood pressure. It's a way to measure this thing that needs to be managed at the population level. And again, your experience on the screen would be something like this. We would ask you some questions at the beginning. So if you're vegan, we don't show you pictures with animal foods in them. If you eat a typical American diet, we do. If you have a cultural diet, we show you that. But either way, we show you two cells from the map and the part of the map you're in and ask which looks more like stuff you eat, A or B. And you just pick one. And then we say, how about now? And you pick one and we say, how about now? We remind you of what your former choice was. We play the game until we've got you, often in as little as 60 seconds, almost never in more than 3 minutes. Then we right size it for you and we can instantaneously report back your diet type, your diet quality, and the details of your food and nutrient intake. So we're taking 90 minutes and reducing it by roughly 2 orders of magnitude to 1 minute. And then we can do all sorts of great things when we have this detailed information. We can use what we know about your baseline diet to go to a personalized version of your goal diet. You think about how GPS works, by the way. In order to give you a turn list, it needs to know both where you are and where you're going. We almost never have that information about nutrition. A detailed assessment of where your diet is and a comparably detailed assessment of where your diet ought to be. Not ought to be because someone's wagging their finger at you, but ought to be because you've got objectives. You want to lose weight or manage your blood pressure, improve your diabetes or whatever it were, optimize athletic performance, improve your cognition, reduce inflammation, whatever it is. We invite people to pick all that pertain. We ask them to tell us if they've got a cultural diet they want to maintain or if they have a dietary pattern like being vegan or vegetarian that they want to maintain. And we then identify a goal diet. We can directly compare the baseline diet to the goal diet and get that down to differences in servings per day and units of nutrients. And then we provide behavioral support that isn't generic. It's not here's how to eat better, but rather here's the specific of sequence of adjustments you can make to your specific diet to get from where you are to where you want to be. That's truly personalized nutrition. And we call it behavioral navigation. It's not behavior modification. It's not your behavior is wrong, we're here to fix it. It's you've said where you are, you've said where you want to go, just like GPS doesn't tell you where to go, you tell it where you want to go, but it helps you get there. That's what behavior change ought to be. Behavioral support, behavioral navigation. What's the sequence of changes I need to make to my diet to incrementally move me in the direction toward my destination, the diet I want to have? So that's what we've put together. And very important to me and very important to the team is that it's multicultural. So if you're Mexican American and you have hypertension, we don't say the DASH diet, good luck. We say we recommend a high quality version of a Mexican American diet, which by the way has the same sodium content, calcium and potassium and magnesium and fiber and all the rest as the DASH diet. And it leaves you in the lane you want to be in. It honors your culture, your heritage, your upbringing, your dietary preferences, and puts you in a position where you can love the foods that love you back. And the set of cultural diets in the map is growing all the time. We have many more than shown here, but this is the idea that you can develop very high quality versions of all sorts of different diets, Mexican, Indian, Caribbean, South American, and so forth. So we do that. And then for clinicians, this provides a comprehensive dashboard. And we're hoping that we can help address the deficiency of nutrition education medicine by providing this level of detail and translating it into, for this given patient, here are the nutrients that most need attention. Here are the food changes that most need attention. Here's how you can, in a limited amount of time, make the biggest difference. So we develop a comprehensive dashboard. And of course, I'm a research scientist. Most of my career has been in clinical research. So we've extensively validated this against all the prevailing instruments, food frequency questionnaire, 24-hour week, all these are publications in the peer-reviewed literature. We've validated this against biomarkers. We've deployed into federally funded studies all around the country at major universities. This is a truncated list. And there's yet one more advantage of this. When I talked about the GLP-1s, I mentioned, excuse me, lots of talking. I mentioned that the cost is my biggest concern. So here, and I see there's a hand raised. I'm nearing the end, and we'll take questions after. Here, so Hannah, just remember your question, please. The issue with diet quality is that it's upstream of changes in biomarkers. It's upstream of chronic disease. It's upstream of bad outcomes. And when you move upstream, you have greater opportunity to make a difference. But one of the things you need to know if you're going to justify food as medicine interventions is how can you pay for them? What are you going to do to the bottom line? So yeah, okay, this is great. We're adding years to life and life to years, but what's the cost? Well, we published a paper in the American Journal of Health Promotion getting at that issue because there's a very strong case in the peer-reviewed literature that when you improve objectively measured diet quality, you can save a lot of money. The average annual per capita cost of obesity versus not is about $2,000. The average annual per capita cost of hypertension versus not is about $2,000. The average annual per capita cost of type 2 diabetes versus not is about $10,000. The average annual per capita cost of symptomatic coronary disease versus not is about $25,000. And in fact, with GLP-1s, all these costs are going to go up. So you don't need to prevent a lot of this stuff to save a ton of money, much more than you need to spend to introduce a food as medicine intervention for a population. So we built an interactive ROI calculator for food as medicine. If any of you are involved in population health efforts and are working to advance food as medicine interventions, and you want to be able to get ahead of what the financials would be, you're very welcome to use this calculator. It's in the public domain. You go to dietid.com. At the top on the marquee, there's science. Just hover over science, scroll down to ROI calculator, and you can plug in the numbers, and you can generate projections about financial savings and a return on investment for any given population. But this allows us to get upstream where we have the greatest potential to do good, but we also have incredible potential to do well because a lot of money can be saved by taking this approach. One final thing with regard to what we're working on, and then I'll be very happy to take your questions. We noticed earlier, remember some of the people that I was working with when we developed this innovation, Walter Willett, David Jenkins, people who are passionate about the health of the planet. Walter is one of the principals in the Eat Lancet Commission work. So all about diet to optimize both human and planetary health. Well, we noticed the way we had put our map together, a fairly obvious gradient in environmental impact because we put diets from animal food centric on the left. So we put paleo and keto way over on the left to plant food exclusive all the way on the right. So the vegan diets are over there. And we put low quality diets at the bottom and high quality diets at the top. So we noticed, well, if you go from bottom left to top right, you're going from animal food predominant and bad, highly processed, to upper right, plant food predominant, plant food exclusive, and high quality, massive environmental impact gradient. What if we created a quantitative measure of that so we could tell people here are the different diets that would satisfy your health objectives? And on a scale of 1 to 10, here are their environmental footprints. Would you like to choose the one that's best for you and the planet? We call this project Diem, as in Carpe Diem, seize the day, because we're running out of time to save our planet as well as ourselves, but also because it's an acronym, Dietary Impacts on Environmental Measures. We've been privileged to work with two leading experts in the environmental impacts of foods, Guidon Echel and Marty Heller, and we've had the help of a postdoc at Harvard, Marie Januszewski. We've been working on this for a while. So we're looking at 4 discrete measures of environmental impact: greenhouse gas emission, land use, water use, and nitrogen use. We're looking at those quantitatively at the level of individual foods, building that up into an aggregate to represent the impact of overall dietary patterns, putting it on a 10-point scale and appifying it so we can say, here's your diet now. Here are the diets that are good for your health objectives. Here are their environmental impact scores. And can we perhaps invite you to choose a diet that's best for you and the planet alike? We'll be introducing this in app form before the end of the year. It's currently in production. So carpe diem indeed, because for a long time, obviously, we've been wrestling with the adverse effects of food, and we've had the weight of our patients' health problems to carry, the obesity pandemic, the chronic disease pandemic. But our problem now extends beyond this. We really have the weight of the world on our shoulders because ecosystems and rainforests and glaciers and aquifers and biodiversity are at stake. And as I said earlier, we have some hope of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet, or we have no hope of being healthy, vital people. So it is for the sake of healthy people on a healthy planet that the evidence all suggests diet quality should indeed be a vital sign. And now we can make it so. And with that, Michael, everybody, I thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'm very happy to open this up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katz. That was some great information. So real quickly, how would people get in touch with you if they wanted to follow your work?
Said a earbud cut out on me. I have a personal website, davidkatzmd.com. I don't know that I've done a terrific job of keeping it fully current, frankly, but you can certainly find me there. My contact information's there. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. And people are welcome to email me. I have multiple email addresses. The one that is sort of public facing would be my Gmail account, davkatz7@gmail.com. Happy to follow up. There are other ways to reach me, but that should suffice.
And people interested in checking out Dr. Katz's books can find them on the realtruthabout.health.com website. And you'll purchase it through Amazon, but we'll get a little bit of money to help fund what we're doing here at The Real Truth About Health. And just real quickly, because I'm seeing something in the chat that some people try to check out your diet ID. And they were saying that it's only available through an organization rather than through an individual. Is that correct? Is there any way for an individual to check that
Yeah,
out?
it's actually one of the reasons I felt comfortable talking to you about it because I'm not selling it to you. So we're not in the App Store. So we if you think about it, you don't have to buy a blood pressure cuff. You can. They're home blood pressure cuffs, and if you want to monitor your blood pressure, you can. But your opportunity to have your blood pressure checked comes to you, right? It's hard to avoid. Anytime you have a medical encounter, your blood pressure gets checked. We feel that's how it ought to be with diet quality. It's actionable. It's information you should have, just like your blood pressure, but you shouldn't have to subscribe to something. So we're a B2B company. We license to health systems. We license to health professionals. However, I also support the interest you may have. Gee, I'd love to get a comprehensive assessment of my diet. You can reach out. There's a contact on the Diet ID website, dietid.com, and my team will respond to you. But the other thing is, if that idea that if you agree, diet quality should be a vital sign, um, whoever is responsible for your healthcare, let them know and let them know about us because we license to clinical practices. It could be as small as a solo practice. So we can make this available to all the patients of a health coach, a dietitian, or a physician. So if you're interacting with anybody in the health system and you'd like access to this, let them know, and then they can secure that access for you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to begin the Q&A portion of our time together. For the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand in Zoom. The instructions are in the chat. So real quickly about this, this product, people are notorious for lying to obviously other people, but also to themselves about how healthy.
Right.
How does your app try to avoid that tendency that people have to do so?
Exactly. And we have evidence that it works. So if you think about it, and by the way, we can be brutally honest with one another and still be compassionate. So yeah, we tend to lie to one another and to ourselves, but these are little white lies, right? I mean, so when you ask somebody how often they've had donuts in the past 6 months, it's not necessarily on purpose that they're going to underestimate their donut intake or French fry intake. And when we ask, how much broccoli, it's not necessarily on purpose that they're going to overstate that a little bit. It's just, we basically are trying to be virtuous, and, we'd like to spin the story in a favorable direction. It's just human nature. It's perfectly fine. But if you think about it, that tendency is amplified when you're going food by food, because every answer to every question is an opportunity to distort. So every time we ask about the so-called bad foods, people are going to underestimate. And every time we ask about a good food, they're going to overestimate. We're aggregating error after error after error. What we've done, we don't eliminate the potential for some distortion, but we mostly do because we give you a dichotomous choice. Which looks more like what you eat, A or B? So you either have to tell a big whopper of a lie. I know it's A and I'm going to say B. That's hard to do. That produces what's called cognitive dissonance. You're trying to get at an honest conclusion, and you're confronted with the option to tell a lie is a lie. And people don't tend to do that. Only genuinely dishonest people do that. So most of us don't do that. And so operationally, we know we had a defense against that tendency to distort. And then we have evidence that it works, because when we've compared ourselves to food frequency questionnaire and 24-hour recall, there's robust correlation, but it's far from perfect. And what we find is Diet ID tends to generate a lower diet quality measure than the food by food measures where those distortions all add up. We tend to generate a higher estimate of calorie intake. So we have all sorts of indications that although we correlate robustly with those past tedious measures, we're correcting their errors. All the differences between the diet ID approach and the prior approaches point in the direction of us fixing those errors. The only way, to perfectly control the information you get is to put people on metabolic wards. And even that doesn't really work because people eat differently on metabolic wards than they eat in the real world, right? So there's no definitive solution to this problem of the potential for distortion, but we think we've substantially corrected it. And it's clearly more than good enough because we have evidence that variation in our measures of diet quality track very robustly with variations in biomarkers, variations with markers of dietary intake, variations in BMI, all the things you would expect if the measure is really working. So we're confident it's really working.
Great. Thank you so much. So you were talking about obesity and character in part of your presentation. How do you find patients who are obese are treated by doctors? Does their obesity status affect the way doctors see them and the way that they prescribe medication and treatments to them?
Yeah, historically it's been absolutely deplorable. And there have been egregious errors in one of two directions, if not both. So one direction is victim blaming. So you basically have a patient with obesity and many other things, and every medical report is about this person's obesity as if everything else is just their fault. It's completely deplorable. And I don't know whether that's a byproduct of something deep in human nature or if it is medical impotence, the fact that medicine is so bad historically at helping people manage their weight. that the frustration results in this response. I'm not sure what the exact psychological reasons are. It's probably a combination of those things, but deplorable. So obesity becomes the story about this person, and implied often is, they're lazy, they're gluttonous. So it's quite deplorable. But in the other direction, it's completely ignored. So I did a lot of medical education in my career. I taught medical students. I was a residency director. So I used to do what we call morning report. So you're in the hospital, you're managing a group of residents. All the patients that get admitted the night before are presented to you. You do ward rounds, so you see the patients. But there were instances where I'd see a patient, and this person, had a BMI well above 40. They weighed over 400 pounds. And because of the awkwardness of dealing with obesity, the resident presenting the case would talk about their health condition and omit that. There'd be no mention of the fact that their weight was clearly a significant driver of many of the things we were trying to address. So either it's maligned or it's ignored, and both of those are bad, because we neither blame the victims of coronary disease nor fail to talk about it, right? I mean, we need to be able to address something with competence and compassion. So those historically have been the problems. And again, that AMA decision years ago to make obesity a disease was an attempt to legitimize it medically so that doctors would do a better job. Sadly, I have not seen, in my experience, a lot of progress yet. I'm hoping there will be more. But in order for there to be the right kind of progress, we need everybody to understand that the root causes of obesity are not in human character. They're not in some pandemic change in willpower or self-control or personal responsibility. They're not in a change in the choices people are inclined to make. They reside in the realm of the choices that people, and we've completely changed those choices in the food supply, and we've changed them in terms of daily schedules, and we've changed them in terms of labor-saving technology. That's where the changes are. That's where the problem resides. And I think that's extremely liberating for provider and patient alike, because we can say, this is not your fault. If you'd been born 100 years ago, you'd probably be lean. If you lived in a different society, you'd probably be lean. You're here, you're mired in all of these obesogenic influences. Now, does that completely exonerate you from playing a role in doing something about it? Clearly not. Every aspect of your health depends as much on you as on anybody else who's involved and part of your team. But it does take a village, and we need to address how you interact with this obesogenic environment, and you need to be empowered with a skill set so you can succeed. It then falls to you to put that skill set to good use. But we absolutely need to get you skilled up. It can't just be about your willpower. And yes, it's important because your weight is contributing to inflammation and your coronary disease and your diabetes and your hypertension. And it's my job to help protect your health. And if your weight is contributing to bad health, then it's important to me in just the same way that your blood pressure would be if it's contributing to bad health, or your cholesterol, if it's contributing to bad health. It's my job to help protect you and empower you with various means to protect yourself. So, the conversation is not difficult to have if you think about it right, but it unfortunately doesn't happen very often.
So, as part of the body positivity movement, there's an idea of obese, healthy people. Is there such a thing? Can you be both obese and healthy, or even if your signs aren't horrendous while you're obese, you'd be healthier if you were less obese?
Yeah, so excellent question. And actually, this came up just recently. There was a spread in the Washington Post about the anti-diet movement, which really originates with the health at any size movement, which in turn shares some of its legacy with the fat but fit concept, popularized by Dr. Stephen Blair at the Cooper Institute, among others. The unfortunate reality is essentially, so yes, it's possible, but, and this is a important but. First, in the real world, few people are, because the things that make people really fit, so if you're genuinely fit, they tend to be things that make you less fat. I mean, at the extreme, you look at endurance athletes. They're almost universally very thin. They're the fittest people on the planet. They're very lean. They're not trying to be lean. They're not focused on their weight. They do the things necessary to be really fit. They wind up being lean. Well, most of us are not Olympic athletes, but to a lesser degree, the same is true. If we do the things to make us genuinely fit, which is high quality fuel, a good diet, and routine physical activity, you're going to wind up being leaner than most people around you. So lean and fit simply go together, whereas fit and fat tend not to, because it's hard to stay fat if you're doing things to make you genuinely fit. There are some people who are genetically and metabolically predisposed to weight gain who exercise quite a lot, who are fitter than most people, and yet still relatively fat. And this was what Dr. Stephen Blair spent his career talking about. So yes, it's true, but at the population level, they're a very small set. What's much more common is not fit and fat, or fit and not fat. Those are the bigger cells. Really fit, truly fit, and yet still truly fat is quite rare. And then the second part of the answer is there have actually been studies that have said, well, let's look at that group. Let's look at fit and yet fat, and comparably fit but not fat, and compare metabolic markers between the two. And as you suggested, Michael, there's a distinction there. So in other words, the people who are fit but fat actually do have some metabolic impairments relative to people who are fit but not fat. In other words, they could still be even healthier if the weight were managed. That doesn't mean weight should be the priority. I believe vitality should be the priority. But since weight is an important indicator of vitality and the potential for years in life and life in years, it can't be ignored. So it's not a myth, fat but fit. It can exist in the population, but there are very few people in that cell in a 2x2 table. So fat, yes, no, fit, yes, no. There are very few people in the yes, fat, yes, fit cell. And even those people in that cell would probably be metabolically better off if they could do something to address excess fatness. And that's because adipose tissue is metabolically active in ways that interact with inflammation, and it's an important body tissue, and having more of it than is optimal for your body causes problems.
So thank you for that answer. In your presentation, you were talking about counting calories, or do calories count, and all that stuff. And you mentioned we can follow up with this in the Q&A. I just want to give you the opportunity to speak more on that topic.
Yeah, so it's just a silly distraction over recent years that there have been many commentaries on, is a calorie a calorie? And from my point of view, sort of pseudo erudition, in other words, acting like you're doing some deep thinking about something that's really quite obvious, self-evident, and superficial. So you could ask the question, is a mile truly a mile? Because after all, you could stroll a mile along a flat, sandy beach on a lovely day, or you could walk a mile in a driving blizzard up the slopes of Mount Everest. So is a mile really a mile? Vastly different experiences, huge differences in the effort, the total experience, whether or not you're having a good time. Although I guess mountaineers may enjoy the driving blizzard on slopes of Everest. But in any event, is a mile really a mile? I mean, what a silly question. A mile is a unit of distance. A mile is a mile. It doesn't mean every mile we go in our lives feels the same or requires the same exertion. So calories are a unit of measure. They measure the energy stored in food. And like any machine, our bodies require energy. So is a gallon really a gallon? What if you use high test versus a different form of gasoline? Since they're different, is a gallon? And oh, by the way, cars vary in fuel efficiency. So is a gallon really a gallon? Yeah, a gallon's a gallon. It's not the only measure that matters. And in the case of calories, they absolutely, undeniably, irrefragably matter. But who wants to spend their life counting them? And it's a losing proposition anyway, because remember Michael Moss's work, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. You are mired in a food supply willfully engineered by highly paid, highly trained, really smart people to make it damn near impossible to stop eating if you eat the wrong things. But all fixable if you eat the right things, because there are many virtues to wholesome foods, mostly plants. Among their many virtues is they fill you up on many fewer calories. So you essentially sidestep that entire problem. So calories count, but I've always had the same antipathy I think most people do to spending a lifetime counting them. I don't think we need to do that. I've never counted calories, by the way. I weigh, I think at this point, because of the age-related muscle loss, I weigh a bit less than I weighed when I graduated high school. but my weight fluctuated in a very narrow range my entire life. I'm not special metabolically. In fact, I gain weight as easily as anybody else. But this is what I do. I mean, if I don't have the skill set to eat well, who would? So I do. So I've eaten well my entire life. I've eaten a diet of whole plant foods and very little of anything else. And the result is I fill up on a healthy number of calories. They count, but I don't need to count them. And frankly, neither do you.
So, given the addictive nature of so much of the food that we're eating, leading people to be addicted, how do people get off of such food?
So I coined the term many years ago, taste bud rehab. So unfortunately and fortunately, one of the most potent drivers of dietary preference is familiarity. It's unfortunate because if you're familiar with a junk food diet, you're going to prefer that. It's fortunate because you can become familiar with a healthier diet and learn to prefer that. What's the evidence that familiarity drives taste preference? Well, we actually have lots and lots of research on the topic, including evidence in neonates showing that the maternal diet during pregnancy, and for that matter, lactation, influences food preference in the newborn. So there's actually some delivery of nutrient components in utero that start to shape taste preference at birth. Really, really interesting. But we also have the evidence from culture. So, you just look around the world and Mexican babies grow up and learn to like chilies because that's what their families eat. And Indian babies grow up and learn to like curries because that's what their families eat. And Japanese babies grow up and learn to like raw fish because that's part of what their families eat, and on it goes. So that's not because we're biologically different. That's not because taste buds differ. We're exactly the same. We're all the same kind of animal. We're all Homo sapiens. We're all part of one big extended human family. We're all very close cousins, but our cultures are different. Familiarity is a major driver of taste preference. So if you go from what you're familiar with and consequently prefer to what is unfamiliar, and you do that suddenly, you need to be prepared for a shock to the system and willing to put up with it, the cold turkey approach, and most people are not. So the alternative would be, okay, look, you eat way too much sugar. You eat way too. You're a typical American. You're soaking your taste buds in sugar and salt and chemicals every day. We need to fix this. So let's fix it by starting to make changes you will not find very objectionable. So let's start with sugar, for instance. Yeah, there's sugar in your dessert, and you care about that, and there's sugar in your soda, and maybe you care about that. But did you know there's sugar in your salad dressing? Because you probably don't care about that. And there's sugar in your pasta sauce. In fact, most commercial pasta sauces, marinara sauces, have more added sugar than ice cream topping. And I'm talking about a direct comparison of the grams on the label. It's unbelievable. So you are unaware of that. You don't need a marinara sauce to have added sugar, for crying out loud, right? You don't mind buying a different marinara sauce that doesn't have the added sugar, that costs the same and tastes as good, right? So what I did with my patients over the years was start with stealth sugar and stealth salt. In other words, take it out of foods where it was hiding, where it was sugar was masked by salt and salt was masked by sugar, where you're not going to really miss it. But we can start there and start to titrate down your exposure by many grams a day. And with each incremental reduction in your exposure, your taste buds become a little more sensitized. And if we give them a few weeks to come out of their coma, all of a sudden the dessert you used to love is going to start tasting too sweet, and the soda you used to like to drink is going to be a little too sweet. And at that point, a few weeks in, we can say, okay, now let's start moving from the stealth mode to those foods that are sweet, and let's start dialing them down and making substitutions. And so in an incremental approach, you give your taste buds time to adapt, you give your palate time to recover. I call that taste bud rehab. Same with salt. So pasta sauce literally may have more added sugar than ice cream topping. Breakfast cereals tend to have more added salt than anything in the salty snack aisle. Why don't people think of breakfast cereals, Cheerios, as a salty snack? Because very often, particularly kids cereals, there's so much sugar, it masks the salt. You're just not perceiving it. And so it's there, it's stimulating your brain, but you're not consciously aware of it. But getting rid of salt in breakfast cereal is pretty easy to do because most people are not eating breakfast cereal as a salty snack in the first place. So though there are lots of opportunities to trade up within a category of food, to do it incrementally, to give your taste buds time to adjust, and then to make additional changes. And at the end of as little, usually as about 12 weeks, you can completely transform the diet. And studies show, including randomized controlled trials, that after that period of habituation, people actually develop aversions to things they used to crave and cravings for things they used to have aversions to. So it's very, very powerful.
All right, so we have about 9 minutes left. So I'm going to let the audience ask a couple of questions here. Evelyn C., state where you're from and ask your question, please.
I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So you were talking about your test measuring 200 nutrients. And I agree that most people won't accurately track their food intake, quality and quantity. But if I really took a lot of personal responsibility and I went on the Chronometer app, which I've tried, but I kind of only did it for about 2 weeks before it was too much homework, basically. But how do you feel about that app? If you are brutally honest about the quality and the quantity. So, like for me, I can put in that I'm having potatoes, but I think the real downfall is that I'm having potatoes fried with oil, let's say. Um, and I'm not sure how that app tracks the quality versus quantity problem. So my second question is about if you could talk about people chasing nutrient deficiency with supplements without first changing their food, and whether you think that we really do need some basic supplements because of the poor quality of the soil, that we should be getting minerals from the soil, but what not. And my third question is, do you tell your practitioners to test nutrients with serum or intracellular testing?
Okay, thanks, Evelyn.
Okay, so I have not been in a position to micromanage the assays for nutrient levels, but to the best of my knowledge, most of the measures are serum or plasma rather than intracellular, just because of the cost of the assay. So when we've done research and published papers, the assays have been fairly standard assays used in clinical practice, for example, at credentialed labs around the country to look at biochemical markers of nutriture. So I don't have much to say on that topic. On the topic of supplements, I think the critical point to make is in the name, supplements, not substitutes. So if you're implying that we too readily turn to supplements and fail to address overall diet quality, I'm inclined to agree with you. So often it's a cop out, basically not worry about my diet and just take a multivitamin. It's kind of how we roll in America. And I'm not talking about this audience. One of the challenges, right, in having these interactions, inevitably, when you're talking to people who come to a nutrition conference, you're much more enlightened about nutrition than the population at large. But most people will blithely take supplements and have them be a substitute for eating well. Very bad idea for many reasons, because of the powerful impacts of overall diet quality, but also because we don't even have names for all the nutrients that matter, right? I mean, there are thousands and thousands of phytochemicals in plants. Some of them are essential nutrients, some of them are non-essential nutrients, some of them we don't know what they are. And we certainly don't know how they all interact with one another, but all of that's probably important. But so supplement, not substitute. But you're right, that there is evidence that the changes in the planet, the changes in the soil can translate into declining levels of nutrient concentrations in foods. We obviously have soil that is routinely deficient in B12. And as a result of that, plant foods are very low in B12. And as a result of that, if you have a plant exclusive diet, you are apt to be relatively deficient in B12. So when we identify specific shortfalls that are not readily addressed with an appropriate focus on overall diet quality, then I have no problem with judicious supplementation. In fact, one of the advantages of what we do at Diet ID is we actually measure your approximate intake of 200 different nutrients from food. So we can identify where, despite your current dietary pattern, are you like to have nutrient shortfalls. And we can recommend personalized supplements to make up those gaps. Now, if we can fix them by improving your diet, great. If some of them are going to persist even when you get your goal diet, that would be an argument for long-term supplementation, whether it's vitamin D or B12 or something, or omega-3s, for example, especially long-chain omega-3s. If you are plant exclusive, you may be able to get ALA into your diet, but you're going to have a heck of a time getting lots of DHA and EPA unless you're eating a fair amount of algae. So, for example, I take an algae-based supplement. I don't want to be eating fatty fish routinely, so I want to get it low in the food chain, sustainable source. I take an algae-based supplement, and I think that's a prudent thing to do. So I'm perfectly fine with judicious use of supplementation, but it's supplemental to, not substitution for, a focus on a healthy diet. And yes, about depletion of soil, and obviously that's a problem. And then your other question about chronometer and yeah, I mean, it's not that it's impossible to get good information about diet by tracking diet. It probably is impossible to get good information about dietary intake from recollection. So food frequency question is remembering how much of what you ate over the past 3 to 6 months. I think that's intrinsically inaccurate. And 24-hour recalls are too subject to spin. So, inevitably when you ask people what they ate yesterday proves to be a particularly great day. But this is different because with Chronometer or MyFitnessPal or a 7-day food journal that you submit to a dietitian, you're writing down what you eat as you eat it. Now, the accuracy of that obviously depends on the granularity of the interface. So if Chronometer asks about potatoes, but not how they're prepared, you're losing relevant detail there. And you're absolutely right. If you eat potatoes that are cooked in butter or cooked in olive oil, two very different things nutritionally. And the bulk of the calories actually may reside in the added spread or oil rather than in the potatoes. So, I mean, depending on how they're prepared in a particular sauce, it might not really be potatoes with butter sauce. It may be butter and, oh, by the way, potatoes, right? And so that's really important. That sort of thing can be missed if you don't have high fidelity interfaces. Most of the apps that are tracking diet are pretty granular and do get to how the food is prepared. So if you give honest answers and you give them in real time, that can be perfectly accurate. So I'm not saying that's inaccurate, but as you noted yourself, it gets really tedious and you stop doing it. And most people aren't going to do it in the first place. So it's kind of the analogy would be that intra-arterial catheter to get your blood pressure. Yeah, we can do it. It's just going to hurt like hell. Most people are going to say no. So it doesn't work at the population level. It doesn't work for the general population. It doesn't work to make diet quality a vital sign. If we want to do that, we have to make it both accurate and quick and easy and effortless and even fun and passive. And that's what we're trying to do. So yes, those work. But as you saw yourself, it's pretty tedious to hang in there.
So one of our participants is asking, people want to get involved in helping educate other people. Are there any places to, obviously there's the idea of people going to, you can take T. Colin Campbell's course and then go become a nutritional coach. Are there any places that are hiring people to get a job in this field to help spread the word, or just you have to go out on your own and do it?
No, there definitely are. I mean, if you have some credentials, I've been involved over the years with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, and frankly, I've seen many of the graduates go on to do really great things, innovations, entrepreneurs, develop companies, develop apps. So some of the innovations are digital, some are other. So they've basically been trained as health coaches. I'm a big fan of Well Coaches, the work of Margaret Moore and others. So you can obviously be a fully realized health professional, but that's years of effort. You could be a dietitian, years of effort. But people are getting training in nutrition and health coaching and combining that with their native aptitudes and passions, whether that's for one-on-one interaction and they're being a coach or some sort of instructor. I mean, you could be a yoga instructor who makes a real effort to learn about nutrition, and you talk both about caring for your body with the movement and nourishing it well, and you could be paying it forward that way. Or if you are inventive and maybe you're an engineer, but you're interested in health, you can combine that aptitude and think about innovations in the digital space, in technology. A lot of people are doing that. So I think there are lots and lots of ways we can all pool our talents and our passions to make a difference.